They laughed first, not out of joy, but out of certainty. The kind of certainty born from years of repetition, doctrine, and carefully curated belief. In the tense stillness of the Cold War, where every radar sweep and every intercepted signal carried the weight of catastrophe, Soviet pilots and strategists convinced themselves that they understood the enemy across the ocean. They believed they had decoded America, a nation loud but shallow, wealthy but inefficient, technologically ambitious yet undisciplined. They believed American power was exaggerated for effect, inflated by propaganda and spectacle, incapable of standing firm when tested by real combat against disciplined opponents. That belief was comforting. It allowed them to smile, to dismiss, to underestimate. And for a time, it felt safe. But while laughter echoed in briefing rooms and confidence hardened into doctrine, something else was unfolding far beyond the reach of slogans and speeches. In the United States, war was not being prepared as a single event or a singular response. It was being engineered as a system. A living, breathing machine built not only by generals and politicians, but by millions of hands working in unison. Engineers bending over drafting tables late into the night. Factory floors illuminated long after sunset. Supply chains stretching across a continent. Universities, laboratories, airfields, shipyards, and test ranges all feeding into one unified purpose. America was not simply building weapons. It was building inevitability. This was not the romantic image of warfare celebrated in old stories. There were no duels, no heroic last stands, no reliance on individual brilliance alone. What the United States was constructing was something far more unsettling to its adversaries, a form of dominance rooted in scale, adaptability, and relentless innovation. Every mistake became data. Every failure became fuel for improvement. Every success was replicated, refined, and multiplied. The result was not just superior hardware, but a strategic environment in which American technology evolved faster than rivals could react. And from this environment emerged an aircraft that would come to embody that transformation in the skies. An aircraft that did not conform to traditional expectations of beauty or elegance. An aircraft that looked wrong to those who still believed in older rules of air combat. Large, heavy, aggressive in posture, and unapologetically complex. The F-4 Phantom II did not announce itself with grace. It announced itself with authority. It was not designed to win approval. It was designed to dominate. To Soviet eyes, the Phantom seemed almost absurd at first glance. Too big, too loud, too reliant on electronics. A machine that appeared to violate the sacred principles of maneuverability and visual combat. In their worldview, a fighter was supposed to be lean and agile, a blade rather than a hammer. They believed speed alone could be matched, and maneuverability could always overcome size. They believed technology could be neutralized by skill. These beliefs were not foolish. They were simply outdated, and the Phantom existed to expose that reality. What the skeptics failed to grasp was that the Phantom was never meant to fight the war they imagined. It was designed for the war that was already unfolding beneath the surface, where detection mattered more than eyesight, where information traveled faster than reflex, and where the first engagement often occurred long before two pilots ever saw each other. The Phantom was a product of a nation that understood something fundamental about modern conflict. Victory belongs to those who shape the battlefield before the battle begins. This understanding did not come from arrogance. It came from experience. The United States had learned, at tremendous cost, that wars were not won by courage alone. They were won by preparation, by logistics, by production, by the ability to sustain pressure indefinitely. The Phantom was a flying expression of that philosophy. It carried within its frame the accumulated knowledge of a country that had transformed itself into the most powerful industrial and technological force the world had ever seen. Every rivet, every circuit, every system reflected a deeper truth. America did not plan to fight briefly. It planned to endure. As the Cold War intensified, the Phantom took to the skies not as a solitary predator, but as part of an ecosystem. It was supported by ground crews trained to service it rapidly and efficiently. It relied on radar networks, intelligence assets, and command structures designed to feed it information in real time. It was armed not just with missiles, but with doctrine, with tactics developed through exhaustive testing and constant revision. While others debated theory, the United States tested reality. And the Phantom became the point where theory met consequence. For those watching from the other side, the realization did not come all at once. It arrived in fragments, in reports that seemed exaggerated, in engagements that ended too quickly, in radar contacts that appeared and vanished without explanation, in the growing suspicion that something fundamental had shifted in the balance of air power. The laughter began to fade, replaced by quiet reassessment. Not panic, not yet, but unease. The kind of unease that emerges when familiar assumptions stop working. What made the Phantom truly unsettling was not its raw performance, impressive as that was. It was the way it forced a rethinking of everything that came before. It demanded new tactics, new responses, new training. It punished hesitation and rewarded coordination. It operated comfortably in environments that had once been considered too complex or too dangerous. And it did so with a confidence that reflected the strength of the system behind it. This was not a machine that depended on luck. It depended on infrastructure. Behind every Phantom that roared into the sky stood a nation capable of producing thousands more. A nation that could replace losses, upgrade systems, and refine designs without slowing its momentum. This reality struck at the core of Soviet confidence, because no matter how skilled a pilot might be, no matter how advanced a single aircraft appeared on paper, it was impossible to ignore the implications of facing an opponent whose capacity seemed limitless. The Phantom was not an anomaly. It was a preview. And still, some clung to old beliefs. Some insisted that size would prove a weakness, that complexity would fail under pressure, that reliance on electronics would become a liability. They told themselves that the American machine was too intricate to survive real combat, too dependent on ideal conditions, too confident in technology. They told themselves these things because the alternative was harder to accept. The alternative meant acknowledging that the future of air combat no longer belonged to those who fought hardest, but to those who built smartest. The Phantom did not need to boast. It did not need to intimidate through appearance alone. Its presence was enough. Every mission it flew, every system it integrated, every role it absorbed reinforced the same message. This aircraft was not a gamble. It was the result of deliberate, sustained effort. It represented a country that understood that superiority is not declared. It is constructed. By the time this truth began to settle in, it was already too late to laugh. The sky had changed. The rules had changed. And the Phantom was only the beginning. What the observers on the other side never fully understood was that the Phantom did not emerge from inspiration alone. It emerged from momentum, From a nation that had learned how to move as one body when pressure mounted, converting urgency into organization and ambition into output. The United States of the mid-20th century was not improvising its strength. It was refining it. The same country that had once turned empty fields into shipyards and assembly lines almost overnight now applied that hard-earned discipline to the skies. The Phantom was not conceived as a gamble on a single breakthrough. It was engineered as the natural continuation of an industrial culture that measured success not in prototypes, but in sustained production. Across the American landscape, the war effort did not announce itself with secrecy or fear. It was visible in the glow of factories that never dimmed, in highways crowded with transport convoys, in airfields where testing never truly stopped. This visibility was not recklessness, it was confidence. Confidence that no adversary could interrupt the rhythm once it was established. Engineers and machinists worked not as isolated specialists, but as links in a chain designed to absorb strain without breaking. When a component failed, it was redesigned. When a process slowed, it was optimized. Every inefficiency became an opportunity for acceleration. The Phantom was born into this environment of relentless refinement. Its design reflected a philosophy that valued adaptability over elegance, resilience over simplicity. Where others pursued purity of form, the American approach embraced complexity, trusting in its ability to manage it. This confidence was not abstract. It was supported by institutions, budgets, and a logistical backbone that stretched from raw materials to operational deployment without interruption. The aircraft that eventually rolled out of the production lines carried within it not only advanced technology, but the accumulated experience of a nation that had mastered the art of scaling innovation. For those accustomed to thinking of aircraft as singular achievements, this approach was difficult to comprehend. In many systems, a breakthrough was treated as a fragile asset, carefully guarded and slowly replicated. In the American system, breakthroughs were treated as starting points. Once proven, they were multiplied, distributed, and improved upon simultaneously. The Phantom benefited from this mindset at every stage of its existence. From its engines to its avionics, from its structural materials to its weapons integration, each element was designed with mass production and continuous upgrade in mind. This was the true source of its power. Not the speed alone, not the payload, but the certainty that it could be built again, repaired quickly, modified efficiently, and supported indefinitely. The Phantom was never meant to be rare. It was meant to be present. And presence, in the language of strategy, is a form of pressure that never relents. While rivals debated how to counter a specific capability, the American system moved ahead, layering new capabilities atop the old without dismantling what already worked. Factories did not merely assemble airframes. They became laboratories of constant experimentation. Lessons from test flights fed directly back into production. Feedback from pilots reshaped training manuals and tactical doctrine. The boundary between development and deployment blurred until improvement became a continuous process rather than a discrete phase. This cycle was difficult to interrupt because it did not depend on a single decision or authority. It depended on culture. A culture that rewarded initiative, tolerated calculated risk, and valued results over tradition. From afar, this approach could be mistaken for chaos. Multiple contractors, overlapping responsibilities, and an apparent lack of rigid central control seemed inefficient to those raised in systems that prized strict hierarchy. Yet beneath the surface, coordination emerged organically through standards, incentives, and shared objectives. The Phantom was a beneficiary of this ecosystem. Its complexity did not paralyze the system. It energized it. Each challenge it presented forced new solutions that strengthened the entire industrial network. As production accelerated, the Phantom began to reveal another uncomfortable truth to its observers. It was not alone. It was part of a family. Variants appeared, each tailored to a specific mission, each building upon the same core platform. This modularity was not accidental. It was intentional, reflecting an understanding that future conflicts would demand flexibility rather than specialization. Where others built different aircraft for different roles, the United States refined a single platform capable of transformation. The Phantom could intercept, strike, reconnoiter, suppress defenses, and adapt again as requirements shifted. This adaptability created a strategic dilemma for adversaries. Planning against a static threat is difficult. Planning against a moving one is nearly impossible. Each attempt to counter one version of the Phantom risked irrelevance as another emerged. Upgrades did not require reinvention. They required integration. New sensors, improved missiles, enhanced electronic countermeasures all could be absorbed without disrupting operations. The aircraft evolved while remaining familiar to its crews and maintainers, preserving institutional knowledge while expanding capability. Behind this technical evolution stood an economic reality that few were willing to confront openly. The United States could afford this pace, not because it ignored cost, but because its economy was structured to support long-term investment in innovation. Defense spending was not a drain isolated from civilian life. It was intertwined with education, manufacturing, and research. Universities trained engineers who fed industry. Industry supplied the military. The military, in turn, generated requirements that pushed technology forward, benefiting the broader economy. The Phantom sat at the intersection of these forces, a visible product of invisible alignment. This alignment made imitation extraordinarily difficult. One could copy the outline of the aircraft, approximate its performance, even replicate individual systems. But copying the system that sustained it was another matter entirely. That system required openness to iteration, tolerance for failure, and a willingness to decentralize problem solving. It required a workforce empowered to improve processes rather than merely follow them. It required a feedback loop between operator and designer that moved faster than bureaucracy could suppress. As reports filtered back through intelligence channels, this realization began to take shape. The concern was not that the Phantom was unbeatable in isolation. No machine ever is. The concern was that it represented a model of warfare that favored those who could outproduce, outadapt, and outlast. Confronting such a model demanded more than tactical adjustments. It demanded systemic change. And systemic change is the hardest form of adaptation, especially when it challenges deeply held assumptions about control and efficiency. The Phantom's very existence forced uncomfortable questions. How does one counter an adversary whose weapons improve while already in service? How does one plan for attrition when replacement is almost immediate? How does one maintain morale when facing an opponent whose capacity seems unaffected by losses? These questions lingered not because they lacked answers, but because the answers required acknowledging disparity at a fundamental level. For the American public, the Phantom became a symbol not of aggression, but of assurance. It embodied the belief that preparation could prevent catastrophe, that strength could deter conflict, and that technological leadership was not an abstract ideal, but a tangible safeguard. It represented the culmination of collective effort, proof that investment in knowledge and industry translated into security. Pride did not stem from the aircraft alone, but from what it revealed about national capability. For those watching from afar, the message was less comforting. The machine in the sky was only the visible edge of a much larger structure. Challenging it meant challenging everything beneath it, and that realization marked a turning point. The laughter had given way to calculation. Calculation soon gave way to concern, because it was becoming clear that the Phantom was not an exception. It was a precedent. As the Cold War deepened and the airspace grew more crowded with intent, the Phantom continued to fly, supported by a system that never slept. Its presence was steady, its evolution constant, its implications profound. The question was no longer whether it could be countered in a single engagement. The question was whether the model that produced it could ever truly be matched. The Phantom did not merely challenge assumptions, it invalidated them. Everything about its existence suggested that the future had arrived earlier for one side than the other. While many still clung to the belief that air combat would forever be decided within visual range, the Phantom was designed from its earliest sketches to operate beyond that horizon. It was not built for the pilot's eyes alone, but for sensors, signals, and information streams that extended far past human perception. In this sense, the Phantom belonged to a different war entirely, one defined not by reaction, but by anticipation. This conceptual shift was profound. For generations, fighter pilots had been trained to trust instinct and sight above all else. Victory was personal, immediate, and visible. The Phantom disrupted that tradition with quiet indifference. Its cockpit was not a place of romantic heroism, but of disciplined coordination. 2 crew members sat in tandem, each performing a role that reflected the complexity of modern combat. The pilot flew the aircraft, managing speed, altitude, and position with precision. Behind him, the radar intercept officer transformed invisible data into lethal decisions, tracking targets that had not yet revealed themselves and guiding weapons that would strike before the enemy understood the danger. To those unfamiliar with this paradigm, the idea seemed excessive, even cumbersome. Why burden an aircraft with additional crew and systems when agility and simplicity had proven effective in the past? The answer lay in the changing nature of the battlefield. Speed had increased, distances had expanded. The margin for error had narrowed. In such an environment, reliance on eyesight alone became a liability. The Phantom acknowledged this reality and embraced it fully, turning complexity into an advantage rather than a weakness. At the heart of this transformation was the Phantom's radar, a system that extended the aircraft's awareness far beyond traditional limits. It could detect, track, and prioritize multiple targets simultaneously, even in adverse weather or against ground clutter that once rendered detection unreliable. This capability altered the rhythm of engagement. Encounters no longer began with visual contact. They began with data, a blip on a scope, a vector calculated, a decision made seconds earlier than the opponent could react. In this new rhythm, the Phantom dictated tempo, forcing adversaries to respond rather than initiate. For Soviet pilots trained in doctrines that emphasized close-range maneuverability, this shift was deeply unsettling. Their aircraft were optimized for turning fights, for exploiting aerodynamic finesse in tight engagements. Against opponents who insisted on closing distance, this approach could be devastating. Against an enemy that refused to play by those rules, it became irrelevant. The Phantom rarely needed to enter the turning fight it was supposedly unsuited for. It chose when to engage, how to engage, and when to disengage, leveraging speed and altitude as strategic resources rather than tactical conveniences. Speed, in this context, was not simply about outrunning an opponent. It was about energy management. The Phantom's ability to climb rapidly and maintain high speeds at altitude allowed it to control the vertical dimension of combat. This control translated into options. Options to attack from above, to retreat upward beyond reach, to reset an engagement on its own terms. In contrast, many adversaries found themselves reacting to threats they could not easily counter, their maneuvers constrained by physics and fuel, while the Phantom operated with apparent freedom. This freedom was amplified by the Phantom's weapons. Guided missiles transformed distance into lethality. The idea that a pilot could destroy an enemy aircraft without ever seeing it challenged centuries of martial tradition. Yet this was precisely the capability the Phantom normalized. Missiles guided by radar and infrared sensors extended the reach of American air power far beyond previous expectations. They reduced reliance on perfect positioning and instantaneous reaction, replacing them with planning, coordination, and system reliability. The Phantom did not eliminate the need for skill. It redefined what skill meant. For those observing from afar, reports of such engagements were difficult to reconcile with established beliefs. Losses attributed to unseen attackers raised uncomfortable questions. How does one defend against an adversary that does not announce itself? How does one train for combat when the decisive moment occurs outside the pilot's field of vision? These questions were not easily answered because they challenged foundational assumptions about control and mastery. The Phantom exposed these vulnerabilities not through spectacle, but through consistency. It performed as designed, repeatedly, methodically, without drama. What made this even more disconcerting was the Phantom's apparent indifference to conditions that traditionally complicated air operations. Poor weather, limited visibility, and electronic interference did not halt its missions. On the contrary, such conditions often favored it. The very environments that once neutralized air power became opportunities. Where others hesitated, the Phantom advanced, its systems compensating for what human senses could not perceive. This reliability reinforced the perception that the aircraft was operating on a plane of capability inaccessible to those who had not made similar investments in technology and training. The Phantom's design philosophy extended beyond combat mechanics to encompass survivability. It was built to endure. Robust structures, redundant systems, and an emphasis on maintainability meant that damage did not necessarily equate to loss. Aircraft returned from missions bearing the marks of engagement, repaired quickly, and sent back into service. This resilience fed into a broader strategic narrative. American air power could absorb punishment and continue operating without interruption. For adversaries accustomed to scarcity and careful conservation, this resilience signaled a dangerous imbalance. As engagements accumulated and patterns emerged, the psychological impact became impossible to ignore. Pilots who once approached combat with confidence began to question their assumptions. Training exercises were revised, tactics were debated. Yet each adjustment seemed reactive, addressing symptoms rather than causes. The Phantom's advantage was not confined to a single metric, it was systemic. Addressing one aspect only revealed another. Countermeasures prompted upgrades. New tactics met revised doctrines. The aircraft evolved, but the underlying disparity remained. This evolution highlighted a deeper divide between competing approaches to warfare. One side sought perfection in individual platforms, optimizing specific characteristics within rigid frameworks. The other embraced flexibility, accepting trade-offs in pursuit of broader capability. The Phantom exemplified this latter approach. It was not the best at everything in isolation, but it was good enough at many things simultaneously, and supported by a system that magnified those strengths. This combination proved difficult to counter with narrowly focused solutions. The realization that the Phantom represented a new category of threat did not arrive as a single moment of clarity. It unfolded gradually through accumulated evidence and hard experience. Each encounter reinforced the sense that the battlefield had shifted beneath familiar feet. Each loss underscored the cost of clinging to outdated models. The laughter that once greeted reports of American excess faded into silence, replaced by a sober recognition that the rules had changed. For the United States, this transformation validated years of investment and experimentation. The Phantom stood as proof that embracing complexity, when managed effectively, could yield decisive advantages. It demonstrated that technology, integrated thoughtfully into doctrine and supported by infrastructure, could reshape the nature of conflict. Pride in this achievement was not merely emotional, it was grounded in results. The Phantom delivered what it promised again and again. For those forced to confront it from the opposite side, the implications were stark. Adapting to this new reality required more than incremental improvement. It required rethinking priorities, reallocating resources, and reconsidering deeply held beliefs about how wars were fought and won. Such changes were neither quick nor easy. And while debates continued, the Phantom kept flying, embodying a future that had already arrived. By the time its presence became impossible to dismiss, the window for easy adaptation had closed. The skies were no longer neutral ground. They were shaped by those who understood that information, speed, and coordination were the true currencies of modern warfare. The Phantom did not simply participate in this transformation, it accelerated it. And as the Cold War moved into its most volatile phases, the question facing those who once laughed was no longer whether the Phantom could be beaten in a single engagement. It was whether they could ever truly catch up to the war it represented. The change did not announce itself with a single catastrophic moment. It arrived gradually, almost politely, slipping into the margins of reports and after-action summaries before forcing its way into strategic consciousness. At first, encounters involving the Phantom were described as anomalies, situations explained away by circumstance, weather, or isolated advantages. But as similar patterns repeated themselves across different regions and contexts, denial became harder to sustain. Something fundamental had shifted in the air, and those who still believed the old rules applied found themselves increasingly out of step with reality. In zones where American influence and Soviet-aligned technology brushed against one another, the Phantom began to assert its presence not through spectacle, but through control. Engagements unfolded on timelines unfamiliar to those accustomed to traditional air combat. The opening move was no longer a visual acquisition or a sudden merge. It was a detection, a lock, a calculated approach guided by data rather than instinct. By the time an opposing pilot realized he was being targeted, the engagement was already unfolding beyond his ability to shape it. This new dynamic altered not only tactics but psychology. The sky, once perceived as a shared arena governed by mutual risk, became asymmetric. The Phantom did not rush to close distance. It lingered at altitude, conserving energy, choosing angles of attack that minimized exposure while maximizing advantage. From below, the threat was often invisible. From above, it was decisive. This vertical dominance eroded confidence in ways that no propaganda could counter. Training emphasized courage and discipline, but neither could compensate for being consistently one step behind. Reports of radar contacts appearing without warning, of aircraft lost before maneuvering even began, accumulated with unsettling regularity. Pilots described the sensation of fighting an opponent they could not fully perceive, an adversary that seemed to anticipate movements before they were executed. Attempts to draw the Phantom into close-range engagements were frequently unsuccessful. It refused the invitation, disengaging with speed and climbing beyond reach, only to return when conditions again favored it. This refusal to conform to expected behavior proved more destabilizing than any single loss. For strategists and planners, the implications were profound. Air doctrine built around the assumption of visual combat suddenly appeared fragile. Exercises designed to refine dogfighting skills did little to address the reality of engagements decided by sensors and missiles. Adjustments were proposed, but implementation lagged behind necessity. Each adaptation required not only new equipment, but new thinking. And thinking, especially when constrained by ideology and hierarchy, does not change as quickly as hardware. The Phantom's influence extended beyond direct encounters. Its presence reshaped how airspace itself was perceived. Areas once considered contested became effectively controlled by the side that could see farther and react faster. This control did not always manifest as destruction. Often, it appeared as deterrence. Aircraft altered routes. Missions were delayed or canceled. The mere possibility of a Phantom operating nearby introduced uncertainty into planning, forcing caution where confidence once prevailed. This quiet influence rarely made headlines, but it accumulated over time, constricting freedom of action. American pilots, operating within this evolving framework, experienced a different reality. Training emphasized coordination, patience, and discipline. Success was measured not by dramatic maneuvers, but by mission completion and survivability. The Phantom rewarded this mindset. It was forgiving of minor errors, resilient under stress, and predictable when operated within its parameters. These qualities fostered trust. Crews learned to rely on their aircraft and on each other, confident that the systems surrounding them would function as intended. This trust translated into composure, even under pressure. On the other side, frustration grew. Pilots trained to excel in close combat found fewer opportunities to employ their strengths. Attempts to force engagements often ended with disengagement by the Phantom, leaving only fleeting glimpses and unanswered questions. The sense of agency that had once defined air combat began to erode. Fighting an opponent who dictated the terms of engagement created a persistent psychological disadvantage, one that extended beyond individual pilots to entire units. As the pattern became undeniable, discussions shifted from tactical fixes to broader concerns. The issue was no longer a single aircraft or a single engagement. It was a system-level disparity. Countermeasures were explored, including electronic interference and revised formations, but each solution encountered limitations. The Phantom's adaptability allowed it to absorb these challenges and continue operating effectively. New tactics prompted new responses. The cycle favored the side with greater capacity for rapid iteration, and in this contest, the advantage was clear. The sky, once a domain defined by mutual exposure, had become stratified. Those who controlled information controlled outcomes. The Phantom thrived in this environment because it was designed for it. Its systems were not add-ons, they were integral. Its doctrine was not improvised, it was cultivated. Each successful mission reinforced the same lesson. Air superiority was no longer a matter of bravery alone. It was a matter of preparation and integration. This realization carried a heavy psychological toll. Pride, long sustained by confidence in doctrine and equipment, began to waver. Acknowledging the shift meant admitting vulnerability. It meant confronting the possibility that years of training were optimized for a battlefield that no longer existed. Such admissions were not made lightly, and resistance persisted. Yet the evidence continued to mount, indifferent to sentiment or ideology. For the United States, the Phantom's impact validated a strategic vision that prioritized depth over simplicity. The aircraft demonstrated that investing in sensors, coordination, and adaptability paid dividends not only in combat effectiveness, but in deterrence. It reduced uncertainty for its operators while increasing it for opponents. This asymmetry was powerful precisely because it did not rely on constant engagement. The Phantom shaped behavior simply by existing. By the time this shift was fully acknowledged, the transformation of the sky was complete. The environment in which future aircraft would operate had been redefined. Speed, altitude, and information formed a triad that governed success. The Phantom sat comfortably at the intersection of these elements, embodying a new standard that others struggled to meet. The laughter that once accompanied its introduction was gone, replaced by careful silence and measured analysis. The sky had changed, not with thunder, but with certainty. And those who had dismissed the Phantom as an overbuilt curiosity now faced a sobering truth. They were no longer fighting the war they had prepared for. They were fighting the war that the Phantom had made inevitable. Speed had always been respected in air combat, but the Phantom transformed speed from a tactical advantage into a strategic weapon. It was not simply how fast the aircraft could fly in a straight line that mattered, but how it used velocity to control the entire geometry of an engagement. The Phantom climbed with authority, surged through altitude bands with ease, and carried its momentum like a stored resource, ready to be spent when the moment demanded. This mastery of energy allowed American crews to dictate not only when combat would occur, but whether it would occur at all. For those accustomed to measuring performance in turning radius and instantaneous maneuverability, this approach was deeply unsettling. The Phantom did not seek the tight circle or the dramatic merge. It sought position, altitude, advantage. From these positions, it could strike decisively or disengage effortlessly. Attempts to chase it upward often ended in futility as the aircraft's engines carried it beyond practical reach. Attempts to outrun it horizontally proved equally frustrating. The Phantom was rarely the fastest in isolation, but it was fast enough, long enough, and at the right moments to make pursuit a losing proposition. This control over distance extended the aircraft's influence far beyond visual range. The Phantom's reach was not confined to what its pilots could see. It extended through radar, through missiles, through command networks that connected aircraft to ground stations and other platforms. Engagements began earlier, ended sooner, and left little room for improvisation by those caught on the wrong side of the equation. The sky felt smaller, more constrained, as if invisible boundaries had been drawn by an unseen hand. Fear emerged not as panic, but as anticipation. The anticipation that any climb, any turn, any deviation from plan might be observed, measured, and countered before it could be completed. Pilots began to describe a growing sense of vulnerability, a feeling that the Phantom was always somewhere above or beyond, waiting. This perception did not require constant contact to sustain itself. It fed on uncertainty, on the knowledge that an opponent existed who could see farther, react faster, and choose engagement on favorable terms. For American crews, this environment reinforced confidence rather than anxiety. Training emphasized patience and discipline, encouraging pilots to resist the urge to close unnecessarily. The Phantom rewarded restraint. Its systems were designed to provide clarity in moments of ambiguity, to reduce cognitive load and allow crews to focus on decision-making rather than survival. This clarity fostered calm. Calm fostered effectiveness. Effectiveness, repeated over time, became reputation. That reputation traveled faster than any aircraft. Stories circulated through informal channels, carried by pilots who compared notes and adjusted expectations. What began as isolated impressions coalesced into a shared understanding. The Phantom was not to be taken lightly. It did not need to dominate every encounter to assert its presence. Its ability to disengage safely was as influential as its capacity to destroy. Knowing when not to fight became as important as knowing how to fight, and the Phantom excelled at enforcing that distinction. The psychological impact of this dynamic cannot be overstated. Air combat had long been associated with immediacy and personal agency. Pilots believed that skill and courage could overcome material disadvantage. The Phantom challenged this belief by demonstrating that systemic superiority could neutralize individual excellence. Facing an opponent who controlled speed, altitude, and information eroded the sense of control that pilots relied upon. This erosion manifested subtly in hesitation, in second-guessing, in conservative decision-making that further tilted the balance. Strategists recognized this effect and understood its value. An adversary constrained by fear and uncertainty is an adversary already weakened. The Phantom's ability to impose this condition without constant engagement represented a force multiplier of immense significance. It reduced risk to friendly forces while increasing pressure on opponents, all without escalating conflict overtly. This balance aligned perfectly with the broader objectives of the Cold War, where deterrence and dominance often mattered more than direct confrontation. As new variants of the Phantom entered service, these advantages were reinforced rather than diluted. Improvements in engines, avionics, and weapons expanded the aircraft's envelope, allowing it to operate effectively across a wider range of scenarios. Each upgrade signaled continuity. The Phantom was not being replaced. It was being refined. This continuity sent a clear message. The system that produced it was stable, confident, and prepared to invest in long-term capability rather than short-term spectacle. Attempts to counter this advantage often focused on individual characteristics. Efforts were made to match speed, to improve climb rates, to refine missiles. Yet these efforts frequently addressed symptoms rather than causes. The Phantom's dominance did not rest on a single metric, it rested on integration, on the seamless interaction between platform, crew, doctrine, and support infrastructure. Matching one element without replicating the others yielded limited results. For those who continued to rely on traditional measures of performance, the Phantom remained a source of frustration. It refused to validate expectations. It did not conform to familiar patterns. It punished assumptions. Each encounter reinforced the same lesson. Modern air combat was no longer about who could turn tighter or accelerate faster in isolation. It was about who could shape the engagement before it began and sustain advantage after it ended. Fear, in this context, was not weakness. It was rational response. Recognizing the Phantom's capabilities forced a reassessment of risk. Missions were planned with greater caution. Routes were altered. Timelines were adjusted. This caution had operational consequences, constraining freedom of action and reducing effectiveness. The Phantom achieved what few weapons ever have. It altered behavior at a strategic level simply by being present. For the American public, these developments remained largely invisible, occurring beyond the horizon and beneath the surface of public discourse, yet they were no less real for that. The Phantom represented assurance that national investment in technology and strategy yielded tangible results. It embodied the belief that preparedness could deter conflict and protect lives. Pride in this achievement was not abstract. It was grounded in the quiet confidence that comes from knowing one's systems work as intended. As the Cold War pressed on, the Phantom continued to fly, carrying with it the accumulated weight of its reputation. Speed, reach, and fear combined to form a triad that defined its influence. It was not merely an aircraft moving through airspace. It was a presence shaping decisions, constraining options, and redefining what it meant to control the sky. And for those who once laughed at its introduction, the realization had settled fully by now. The Phantom was not a temporary advantage. It was a manifestation of a deeper imbalance. One that could not be corrected quickly or easily. One that demanded more than new machines. It demanded a new way of thinking. What ultimately separated the Phantom from its contemporaries was not a single moment of brilliance, but its refusal to be confined to one purpose. While many aircraft were designed to excel in a narrow role, the Phantom was conceived with a broader ambition. It was not content to dominate one corner of the battlefield. It sought relevance everywhere. This ambition reflected a distinctly American approach to power, one that valued versatility, adaptability, and the ability to respond to changing demands without starting over. The Phantom embodied this philosophy in metal, wiring, and doctrine. From the outset, the aircraft was built to be more than a pure interceptor. Its structure, payload capacity, and systems architecture allowed it to assume roles that would normally require entirely different platforms. It could hunt enemy aircraft at altitude, then descend to strike ground targets with precision and force. It could penetrate defended airspace, gather intelligence, suppress enemy defenses, and return with information that reshaped the next phase of operations. Each mission reinforced the same truth. The Phantom was not a specialist. It was a problem solver. This flexibility proved decisive in an era defined by uncertainty. The Cold War rarely offered clear lines between peace and conflict. Crises erupted unexpectedly, demanding rapid responses tailored to specific circumstances. In such an environment, the ability to reconfigure capability quickly became invaluable. The Phantom could be armed, briefed, and launched to meet evolving objectives without waiting for entirely new assets. This responsiveness projected strength precisely because it reduced hesitation. Decisions could be made confidently, knowing the aircraft could execute them. For those observing from the opposite side, this adaptability introduced a new layer of frustration. Planning against a multi-role platform complicated prediction. An aircraft approaching airspace might be an interceptor, a strike platform, or a reconnaissance asset, or all three in sequence. The Phantom blurred categories that adversaries relied upon to structure their defenses. This ambiguity strained intelligence assessments and forced conservative assumptions, further constraining operational freedom. The aircraft's ability to absorb new technology amplified this effect. As sensors improved and weapons evolved, the Phantom incorporated these advances without losing coherence. It became a testbed for innovation, a platform through which emerging concepts could be operationalized quickly. This process did not occur in isolation. It was supported by training programs that evolved alongside the aircraft, ensuring crews could exploit new capabilities effectively. The result was a feedback loop in which technology and doctrine advanced together, reinforcing each other rather than competing for priority. This synergy was particularly evident in the Phantom's electronic warfare and reconnaissance roles. As air defenses grew more sophisticated, the ability to detect, deceive, and suppress them became critical. The Phantom adapted by carrying specialized equipment that extended its influence beyond direct combat. It could map enemy radar networks, identify vulnerabilities, and contribute to operations that neutralized threats before they could be engaged. These missions required precision, coordination, and confidence in systems qualities the Phantom consistently delivered. The psychological impact of this versatility was significant. Facing an aircraft that could change roles without warning undermined confidence in fixed defenses. It forced adversaries to prepare for multiple contingencies simultaneously, diluting focus and resources. Each additional role the Phantom assumed represented another dimension of pressure, another reminder that the American approach favored breadth as well as depth. This breadth made the aircraft difficult to counter because it resisted simplification. For American forces, the Phantom's multi-role nature reinforced institutional learning. Crews gained experience across mission types, fostering a holistic understanding of air operations. This cross-pollination of skills enhanced flexibility at the human level, complementing the aircraft's technical adaptability. Pilots and operators learned to think in terms of systems rather than isolated tasks, aligning their mindset with the broader strategic framework. This alignment was a force multiplier in its own right. The Phantom's longevity further underscored the value of this design philosophy. Rather than being rendered obsolete by the emergence of new requirements, it found renewed purpose through adaptation. Upgrades extended its service life, allowing it to remain relevant even as newer aircraft entered the inventory. This continuity preserved experience and reduced transition costs, enabling a smoother evolution of capability. The aircraft became a bridge between generations, linking past lessons with future innovation. For those struggling to keep pace, this continuity highlighted a stark contrast. Developing a new platform from scratch required time, resources, and organizational flexibility. The Phantom, by contrast, evolved incrementally, leveraging existing infrastructure and expertise. This incremental evolution proved more resilient than wholesale replacement, allowing the United States to maintain capability while exploring new technologies. It was a pragmatic approach grounded in realism rather than idealism. As the Cold War progressed, the Phantom's reputation as a multi-role machine solidified. It was respected not for any single achievement, but for its consistent performance across diverse challenges. This consistency bred trust, and trust bred reliance. Commanders planned operations knowing the Phantom could adapt to unforeseen developments. This confidence reduced friction at every level, from planning to execution. For adversaries, the message was clear. They were not confronting a static opponent or a narrow capability. They were confronting a system designed to absorb complexity and turn it into advantage. The Phantom was a visible manifestation of that system, but it was not its limit. It hinted at what would come next, signaling that adaptability itself had become a weapon. In this sense, the Phantom's greatest contribution may not have been any single mission or engagement. It was the precedent it set. It demonstrated that versatility, when supported by infrastructure and culture, could redefine power projection. It showed that success in modern warfare belonged to those who could respond faster than circumstances changed. And it forced others to confront an uncomfortable reality. Competing with such a model required more than matching specifications. It required matching philosophy. By the time this lesson was fully appreciated, the Phantom had already reshaped expectations. It had proven that an aircraft could be many things without losing identity. It had shown that flexibility was not compromise but strength. And it had reinforced the belief that American air power derived its greatest advantage not from any single machine, but from the system that allowed that machine to evolve, adapt, and endure. As the Cold War matured, the most decisive battles were no longer fought where the eye could follow them. They unfolded in frequencies, signals, pulses of energy that crossed the sky faster than any aircraft. In this environment, the Phantom revealed a dimension of power that went largely unseen yet deeply felt. It became a participant in a war that existed before the first missile launch and long after the last. Engine shut down a war of detection, denial, and dominance over information itself. This invisible conflict shaped outcomes without spectacle, and the Phantom thrived within it. Electronic warfare transformed the meaning of presence in hostile airspace. The ability to interfere with enemy sensors, to confuse tracking systems, and to degrade communications altered the balance between offense and defense. The Phantom integrated these capabilities not as an afterthought, but as a core component of its mission set. Pods, antennas, receivers, and processors turned the aircraft into a moving node in a larger network, capable of sensing threats and responding in real time. This integration allowed American forces to operate with confidence in environments designed to repel them. For adversaries, this shift was profoundly disorienting. Traditional defenses relied on the assumption that detection led naturally to engagement. Radar found the target, weapons followed. The Phantom disrupted this sequence. It could reveal itself selectively, mask its approach, or distort the picture presented to defenders. Targets appeared where none existed. Signals vanished without explanation. Systems behaved unpredictably, undermining trust in the very tools meant to provide certainty. This erosion of confidence had operational consequences, slowing decision-making and increasing hesitation at critical moments. The Phantom's role in suppressing air defenses exemplified this new reality. Rather than confronting threats head-on, it sought to neutralize them through exposure and deception. By identifying radar emissions and exploiting their characteristics, the aircraft contributed to operations that dismantled defensive networks piece by piece. These missions demanded courage, precision, and absolute trust in technology. They also demonstrated a level of integration between aircraft, intelligence, and command that few could replicate. The Phantom did not act alone. It acted as part of a coordinated effort that multiplied its effectiveness. This coordination extended beyond individual sorties. Information gathered during missions fed into analysis that refined future operations. Patterns were identified, weaknesses mapped, and responses adjusted. The cycle repeated, each iteration sharpening the American advantage. The Phantom was both consumer and producer of this intelligence, benefiting from insights while contributing to their expansion. In this way, the aircraft became a conduit through which knowledge flowed, linking tactical action to strategic understanding. For those attempting to counter these capabilities, the challenge was daunting. Developing electronic countermeasures required not only technical expertise, but access to comparable resources and testing environments. It demanded flexibility to update systems rapidly and train personnel continuously. Even when progress was made, it often lagged behind the pace of American adaptation. The Phantom's ability to integrate new technologies ensured that countermeasures were met with countermeasures, perpetuating a cycle that favored those with greater capacity for innovation. The psychological dimension of this invisible war was as significant as its technical aspects. Pilots and operators found themselves operating in an environment where familiar cues could no longer be trusted. The reliability of sensors, once a source of reassurance, became a point of vulnerability. Doubt crept into decision-making, complicating already complex tasks. Facing an opponent who could manipulate perception itself forced a re-evaluation of assumptions about control and awareness. For American crews, this environment reinforced the importance of training and discipline. Mastery of systems required not only technical proficiency, but composure under uncertainty. The Phantom rewarded crews who trusted their instruments and procedures, who understood the interplay between technology and tactics. This trust was cultivated deliberately, through rigorous preparation and constant refinement. It became a hallmark of American air operations, distinguishing them from those less accustomed to managing complexity. The invisible war also reshaped strategic calculations. Control of airspace was no longer measured solely by aircraft counts or visible patrols. It was measured by influence over the electromagnetic spectrum, by the ability to operate freely while denying that freedom to others. The Phantom contributed to this control by extending American reach into domains that could not be easily contested. Its presence signaled that challenges would be met not only with force, but with sophistication. As these dynamics unfolded, the broader implications became clear. The Phantom was not simply a tool of destruction. It was a tool of pressure. By imposing uncertainty and constraining options, it shaped adversary behavior in subtle but persistent ways. Missions were delayed, plans were revised, opportunities were missed. Each adjustment reflected an acknowledgement of American capability, even if it was never stated openly. This form of dominance was difficult to counter because it did not rely on overwhelming numbers or constant engagement. It relied on superiority in preparation, integration, and execution. The Phantom exemplified this approach, demonstrating that the most effective power is often the least visible. Its influence extended beyond the immediate battlefield, shaping perceptions and expectations across entire theaters of operation. For the United States, success in this invisible war reinforced confidence in its strategic approach. It validated investment in research, training, and integration. It showed that technology, when guided by doctrine and supported by infrastructure, could provide decisive advantages without escalating conflict unnecessarily. The Phantom stood as evidence that strength need not always be loud to be effective. For those confronting it, the lesson was sobering. Competing in this domain required more than matching hardware. It required cultivating an ecosystem capable of sustaining rapid innovation and adaptation. It required accepting uncertainty as a constant and managing it proactively. These requirements challenged deeply ingrained habits and structures, making adjustments slow and incomplete. As the Cold War continued, the invisible war grew in importance. Signals multiplied, systems evolved, and the Phantom remained at the center of this transformation, a platform that bridged the gap between kinetic force and informational dominance. It proved that control of the unseen could be as decisive as control of the visible. By the time this reality was fully internalized, the Phantom had already reshaped the contest. It had shown that modern warfare extended beyond the horizon of sight into realms where preparation and integration mattered more than raw aggression. And in that realm, the advantage it represented was unmistakable. As the implications of the Phantom's dominance became impossible to ignore, attention turned toward imitation. If the aircraft itself could not be dismissed, perhaps it could be replicated. This impulse was natural, almost inevitable. Throughout history, rivals have sought to narrow gaps by copying what works. Yet in the case of the Phantom, imitation proved far more complex than anticipated. The aircraft was not a singular invention that could be reverse-engineered in isolation. It was the visible outcome of a deeper process, one that resisted replication because it was rooted in culture, infrastructure, and philosophy rather than blueprints alone. Efforts to respond often focused on matching visible characteristics. Speed could be pursued. Altitude could be challenged. Weapons could be improved incrementally. On paper, progress appeared tangible. New designs promised better performance in specific regimes, and technical achievements were celebrated. Yet these advances frequently failed to translate into parity. The Phantom's advantage did not lie in excelling at one metric. It lay in the coherence of the whole. Each component was optimized not only for performance, but for integration. Changing one element without harmonizing the others yielded diminishing returns. This mismatch exposed a fundamental limitation. Building an aircraft was achievable. Building the ecosystem that sustained it was far more difficult. The Phantom benefited from a continuous pipeline of testing, feedback, and refinement that blurred the line between development and operation. Crews communicated directly with engineers. Engineers adjusted designs based on real-world use. Training evolved in parallel with technology. This feedback loop moved quickly, unencumbered by rigid separation between roles. Attempts to replicate the aircraft without replicating this loop inevitably fell short. Organizational rigidity compounded the challenge. Systems that prioritized centralized control and strict adherence to doctrine struggled to adapt at the pace required. Innovation, when constrained by hierarchy, moved cautiously. Approval chains lengthened timelines. Fear of failure discouraged experimentation. In contrast, the Phantom thrived on calculated risk. It was a product of an environment that accepted imperfection as a step toward improvement, that rewarded initiative and tolerated mistakes when lessons were learned. This cultural difference proved as decisive as any technical disparity. The gap widened further as the Phantom continued to evolve. Upgrades were not reactive patches, but deliberate enhancements aligned with emerging threats. New avionics improved situational awareness. Enhanced weapons expanded engagement options. Electronic warfare systems grew more sophisticated. Each iteration reinforced the aircraft's relevance, extending its service life and deepening its integration into broader operational concepts. For those attempting to catch up, the target kept moving. This moving target created frustration at multiple levels. Engineers recognized what was required, but lacked the resources or freedom to implement changes rapidly. Pilots sensed the disparity in operational contexts, even when individual engagements appeared balanced. Planners grappled with the realization that matching specifications did not equate to matching capability. The Phantom forced a reckoning with the limits of imitation when underlying systems diverged. The pride invested in domestic solutions made acknowledgement of this reality difficult. Admitting that an adversary's approach was fundamentally more adaptable challenged narratives of self-sufficiency and ideological superiority. Yet evidence accumulated relentlessly. The Phantom remained in service, relevant and effective, while newer designs elsewhere struggled to achieve comparable longevity or flexibility. Longevity itself became a marker of success. An aircraft that could adapt across decades signaled a design philosophy attuned to change rather than perfection. For the American audience, this endurance reinforced a sense of confidence rooted in pragmatism. The Phantom was not celebrated as flawless. It was celebrated as resilient. It demonstrated that success did not require getting everything right the first time. It required building systems capable of learning. This lesson resonated beyond aviation, reflecting broader national strengths in innovation and adaptation. Pride stemmed not from dominance alone, but from the process that sustained it. For rivals, the lesson was more sobering. Catching up would require more than accelerated programs or isolated breakthroughs. It would require embracing a different relationship between industry, military, and innovation. Such a transformation was possible in theory, but difficult in practice. It demanded trust, decentralization, and long-term investment qualities, not easily cultivated under pressure or ideological constraint. The Phantom's continued presence served as a constant reminder of this disparity. Each year it remained operational underscored the durability of the system that produced it. Each successful mission reinforced the notion that adaptability, once institutionalized, becomes self-reinforcing. The aircraft was no longer merely a benchmark. It was a symbol of a model that others struggled to emulate. As the Cold War progressed, this realization settled into strategic thinking. Competing directly with the Phantom's strengths became less feasible than seeking asymmetrical responses. Yet even these efforts acknowledged the Phantom's influence, defining themselves in relation to it. The aircraft shaped the conversation, setting standards that others measured themselves against, whether they admitted it or not. In this way, the Phantom achieved a form of dominance that extended beyond performance. It established norms. It redefined expectations. And it demonstrated that true superiority lies not in isolated achievements, but in the ability to sustain progress over time. The pride embodied in the Phantom could not be copied because it was not contained within the aircraft itself. It resided in the system that built, supported, and evolved it, a system that proved remarkably difficult to replicate. Time, which renders most weapons obsolete with quiet efficiency, seemed reluctant to claim the Phantom. As newer aircraft entered service and headlines shifted to sleeker silhouettes and more exotic technologies, the Phantom remained sometimes in the foreground, sometimes in supporting roles, but always relevant. This persistence was not accidental. It was the consequence of a design philosophy that anticipated change and embraced evolution as a constant rather than an exception. Where others faded as doctrines shifted, the Phantom adapted, proving that longevity itself could be a strategic asset. In many air forces, the aircraft transitioned seamlessly from frontline dominance to specialized missions that demanded experience and reliability. Reconnaissance variants mapped hostile territory with precision, feeding intelligence pipelines that informed strategic decisions. Electronic warfare configurations confronted emerging threats in the electromagnetic spectrum, suppressing defenses and opening corridors for other aircraft to operate safely. Each new role extended the Phantom's utility and reaffirmed the wisdom of a platform built to absorb complexity without collapsing under it. This adaptability carried symbolic weight. An aircraft that could serve across decades sent a message about the resilience of the system behind it. It suggested continuity of purpose, the ability to refine rather than replace, and confidence in incremental improvement. For American forces and allies alike, the Phantom became a familiar presence, a known quantity in an uncertain world. Familiarity bred trust, and trust reduced friction in planning and execution. Missions could be designed around capabilities that were understood deeply, honed by years of experience. Allied adoption further amplified this effect. Nations with diverse strategic needs and operational environments integrated the Phantom into their air forces, tailoring it to local requirements while benefiting from the shared knowledge base that accompanied it. This global footprint created a network of users whose collective experience enriched the platform's evolution. Lessons learned in one theater informed adaptations in another, reinforcing the aircraft's relevance and strengthening the bonds between partners. The Phantom became not just an American asset, but a cornerstone of cooperative security. For former adversaries, the aircraft's endurance was a persistent reminder of missed opportunities and structural disparities. Watching a platform remain effective long after its introduction challenged assumptions about technological cycles and forced a reconsideration of what constituted modernity. The Phantom did not rely on novelty to justify its existence. It relied on performance, adaptability, and integration. Each year it continued to fly underscored the difficulty of matching a system that valued learning as much as innovation. The aircraft's presence in later conflicts demonstrated this principle vividly. In environments far removed from the Cold War's ideological standoff, the Phantom continued to contribute meaningfully. Its ability to carry diverse payloads, operate from varied bases, and integrate updated systems allowed it to address emerging challenges without extensive redesign. This flexibility proved invaluable in regions where threats evolved rapidly and resources demanded careful allocation. The Phantom met these demands with quiet competence. Even as retirement loomed, the aircraft found new purpose. Some were converted into unmanned targets, their robust airframes and performance characteristics providing realistic training environments for newer generations of pilots. Others were preserved in museums, not as relics, but as testaments to an era when engineering ambition reshaped the boundaries of possibility. For those who had flown or maintained the Phantom, these preserved airframes represented more than nostalgia. They embodied a period of intense learning and adaptation, a time when the future was uncertain and preparation mattered deeply. This enduring presence reinforced a broader lesson about power and progress. Systems designed with flexibility and supported by institutions capable of learning can outlast those optimized narrowly for immediate advantage. The Phantom's legacy lay not only in its combat record, but in the mindset it reflected. It demonstrated that relevance is sustained through evolution, not perfection. That willingness to adapt can be more valuable than initial brilliance. For the American audience, this legacy resonates as a source of pride grounded in pragmatism. The Phantom was never portrayed as flawless. Its limitations were acknowledged, addressed, and incorporated into future designs. This honest engagement with reality strengthened rather than weakened its reputation. It showed that strength emerges from confronting shortcomings directly and responding decisively. The aircraft's long service life became a narrative of continuous improvement, mirroring broader national strengths in innovation and resilience. For those who once underestimated it, the Phantom's refusal to fade quietly was perhaps its most humbling attribute. It lingered as evidence that the assumptions made at its introduction were not merely incorrect, but inverted. The aircraft that seemed too large, too complex, too reliant on technology, proved to be precisely what the future required. This inversion carried strategic implications, challenging deeply held beliefs about simplicity and control. As the Cold War receded into history, the Phantom's influence remained embedded in doctrine and design philosophy. Successive generations of aircraft inherited lessons forged through its service lessons about integration, multi-role capability, and the importance of systems thinking. These lessons extended beyond aviation, informing approaches to problem-solving in an increasingly complex world. The Phantom's true legacy was thus not confined to the sky. It lived on in the principles it validated. In refusing to die quietly, the Phantom achieved a form of immortality. It became a reference point, a benchmark against which others were measured. Its story illustrated that power sustained over time is rarely the result of a single breakthrough. It is the outcome of persistence, adaptation, and the courage to evolve. And in this story, the Phantom stood as a testament to a nation that understood the value of building for the long term. In the end, the Phantom was never just an aircraft. It was an idea given form, a declaration made not through words, but through steel, circuitry, discipline, and resolve. It represented a moment in history when the United States chose to confront uncertainty not with hesitation, but with preparation. When it understood that the future of conflict would not be decided solely by courage or tradition, but by the ability to think ahead, to build broadly, and to adapt relentlessly. The Phantom embodied that understanding in every mission it flew and every role it assumed. What made the Phantom extraordinary was not that it was unbeatable, but that it was inevitable. It was the product of a nation that had aligned its institutions, its industry, and its intellect toward a common purpose. Universities produced engineers who imagined possibilities beyond existing limits. Factories translated those possibilities into reality at scale. Pilots and crews transformed machines into operational power through training and trust. Each element reinforced the others, creating a system greater than the sum of its parts. The Phantom did not stand alone. It stood at the center of this system, visible proof of what coordination and commitment could achieve. For adversaries, confronting the Phantom meant confronting this broader reality. It forced a recognition that competing in modern warfare required more than matching speed or firepower. It required matching philosophy. It required embracing uncertainty, tolerating experimentation, and investing continuously in people as much as technology. These requirements challenged deeply ingrained habits and structures, making adaptation slow and uneven. The Phantom exploited this gap not through arrogance, but through consistency. It kept flying, it kept evolving. And with each year, it reinforced the lesson that preparation, once institutionalized, becomes difficult to overcome. For the American public, the Phantom's story offers more than a chapter in military history. It offers reassurance that deliberate effort yields enduring strength. That investment in knowledge and infrastructure pays dividends not only in moments of crisis, but across generations. The Phantom's longevity reflects a confidence that transcends any single conflict. It speaks to a belief in progress achieved through persistence, in security achieved through foresight, and in leadership earned through responsibility rather than proclamation. The aircraft's influence extended well beyond the Cold War. Its lessons shaped the design of successors, informed doctrine, and contributed to a broader understanding of how technology and strategy must evolve together. The Phantom taught that complexity, when managed intelligently, can be a source of resilience rather than fragility. It demonstrated that flexibility is not a compromise, but a strength. These lessons remain relevant in an era where challenges are increasingly interconnected and solutions demand integration across domains. As time moves forward and new technologies redefine the boundaries of possibility, the Phantom's legacy endures as a benchmark. It reminds us that superiority is not a momentary condition, but a sustained effort. That dominance is built quietly through countless decisions made far from the spotlight. That true power lies not in spectacle, but in systems that function reliably under pressure. The Phantom was a manifestation of these truths, carrying them into the sky with unmistakable authority. When historians look back on the Cold War, they will find no single battle that defines its outcome. Instead, they will find a series of choices about how nations prepared for conflict they hoped never to fight. Among those choices, the creation and deployment of the F-4 Phantom II stands as a defining example. It symbolized a commitment to readiness, to innovation, and to the belief that strength rooted in preparation can deter disaster. The Phantom's engines may have fallen silent, but the idea that carried them forward has not. It lives on in the systems that replaced it, in the doctrines it inspired, and in the confidence it instilled. It lives on in the understanding that wars are often decided long before the first shot is fired, by those who choose to build rather than react. In this sense, the Phantom never truly left the sky. It simply passed its legacy forward. And that legacy remains clear. When the future was uncertain, the United States did not wait to be challenged. It prepared, it built, and it proved that superiority, once earned through effort and vision, can endure far beyond the era that gave it birth.